Okay, welcome back. So I was listening to the screencast, the previous one, and man, I sounded like I was falling asleep. So I can only guess what y'all were doing. Anyway, I grabbed a Coke. I've got some caffeine in my body, and so hopefully this one will be a little bit more energetic. This is the code that we left off with in the last screencast. Let's take a look at some new code that we're going to be using. Two new files, quite a bit more functionality. Let's see what it does first. So I'm going to start up my server, node index, and let's take a look at what it does. I'm going to put into my URL here, I'm going to put index. And then I'm going to put show. And finally, I am going to place in here foo. All right, just like we had before, we're returning the path name to the browser. But let's take a look at the console. I'm going to highlight kind of the important parts of this log file. And as before, we have the request for index. That's the path name. We did that in the last section. What's important here is that we actually have something recognizing that I typed in index. Before, you could have typed in anything and it would always say that there's going to be a request for this, whatever I had typed in. Now it recognizes that I've typed in index. The third line not only recognizes it, but it now is passed a function that is also logging to the console this line here, and that is that the request action index was called. And if we scroll down here, we can see the same happened for show. Probably more importantly, when I put in foo, it got the request in the first line. The second line said, hey, I'm about to make a request for foo, but the third line did not recognize that as a route. So we didn't have an associated controller for that route for foo, and it let us know that. Okay, how did we do that? Let's take a look. I've returned our code to the state it was in at the end of the last screencast. So let's get started. Let's go ahead and build our router. So I'm going to create this router.js file and create a function called route, and we're going to pass it our path name that we've been using, for example /index, and I'm going to log to the console the fact that we're about to route a request for our path name, like /index. And I want to export this little module here. Our function route, I want to export it and I'm going to call it route. Okay, so we have our function. Next, let's go over to index.js and require our new module. So as you recall, router matches up with router.js, and we're just going to call it router. And that's how we'll have access to it through that variable. And then this is something a little bit different. We're going to actually pass the router as an argument to example over here. And we're going to do that by typing out router root. So this function root is being passed as an argument to our example function. So that means we need to put that in our example function. And now in our on request, we're going to grab the path name and we are going to call our function route, and we are going to pass it our path name. Let's take a breather here for a second and let's look at what we've done. When the index file is launched, it's going to require our two modules. It's going to run example and pass our route method to example. And the server is going to start. And then on a request, we're going to parse that URL, and then we're going to pass the path name to the function route and log that we're about to route a request for path name. So as it stands right now, let's save these files and go in and run it. So I'm going to stop our earlier server and let's start our new file here. So now I'm going to type in, let's say, index, and we're going to get, should be no surprise, our /index was received, but let's go to the console and see what happened. Our request was received, and now we have about to route a request, and it did grab the right path name index. Great. Okay, but that doesn't do a whole bunch, because what we want to happen is for there to be a reaction to that. So we want /index to run different code than we would say /show. So how do we do that? So let's set up this user controller. And for our first action, which is index, we're going to create a function. And we're going to say, all right, I want to log that this request action, in this case index, was called. And let's go ahead and do the same thing for show. And do the same thing in terms of logging request action show was called. And now, just like we've done with the other modules, we want to export our index function, and we'll call it index. And we want to export our show function, and we're going to call it show. Okay, so what do we have to do now to get this user controller to be accessed as a result of the path name? Well, the first thing I want to do is take our new module that we created here, the user controller, and require it in our index.js file. So I'm going to have it equal to require, and we're going to look at this file name and put in user controller. All right, next I need some way to associate these actions, index and show, with the path name /index and /show and any other paths or routes that we want to provide. I'm going to do that by creating an object called routes, and then I'm going to start assigning it routes. So the first route will have the key name /index, and that's going to be equal to the user controller module and the method within that user controller module of index. And then another route, and I bet you can guess which is going to come next, which is show, and that's going to be also in that module under show. So now we have this object that we can test and point to the function. We need to make this router smaller or smarter, but before we do that, we need to pass routes throughout our whole system here. So we're going to pass it as an argument here in the example function. So that means we need to put it here as well. And ultimately it's going to go to our route function, so we're going to put it here. And finally, since it is in our routes function, we're going to put it here. All right, so now we have access to routes, and now we're going to make our router smarter. And we're going to do that by putting in an if statement. So we're going to look at the type of, for routes, path name, and So if routes path name, excuse me, not here, what am I saying? Over here. If routes path name, so the routes and the path name, so the first time I did it, it was /index. So routes /index is equal to a function, then we know that there's an associated function over here in our user controller, and we want to call it. So we'll call routes path name. Else, if it doesn't find one, we want to log something to the console. Let's log a message here that says no request route found for our path name. Okay, so let's go through it. We're going to create our routes. We're going to pass that to the server module example function. It's going to create our server. On a request, it's going to parse the path name out. It's going to pass that path name and our routes object to the route function. The route function is then going to process that path name and see if a routes function exists. And if it does, then it's going to move over here to the user controller and execute one of these two functions. If it does not find one, then it's going to give us this else message. Okay, let's see if that actually works. Save these files really quickly. Come over here, restart the server. Up. Let's see, what do we have here? Let's see what I did. I did not wrap this in single quotes or double quotes. Okay, I bet it works now. So let's run it for show. Let's run it for index. And let's run it for foo. Let's go back through our console here and find index. Let's see, the request for index. Yep, got that. About to route request for index. Yep, and it found the index action. And then for show, I guess that was up here. Yep, here we go. So here's show. Received about to request for show, and then it found the show action. And then finally for foo, here it is, the request, the about, and it did not find the foo route, and we know why. Okay, final part of our little exercise here. So let's say, we have some business logic here that we want to put in, and I'm not going to separate the controller into a separate view. That's part of the MVC pattern, but this was really to kind of get a basic overview of setting up a controller and route. I'm also not, we're not going to implement an ARM here and be able to bring in a database, but I'm going to go ahead and create an object here. I'm going to call it users, and we'll kind of fake it that we've got some user objects here. I'm just going to say user1 is equal to John Doe and user2 is equal to John Smith. You can tell I'm not real creative. User3 we'll call John Wayne. Okay, that's enough. We're going to have a for-in loop that will go through these guys, and for now we'll just log that to the console. Okay, let me make sure that works. Restart the server. I believe that was the index action. Let's go back into the console. Okay, and we have our list there. But, you know, we don't want to log it to the console. We want to actually write it out via Node. So how do we do that? Well, to make this non-blocking, we're going to basically pass the response through our chain here so we have access to it at the user controller. And the way that we do that is pretty simple. Okay, first we're going to pass it in the route there. So this is the response. This is the object that we get back from Node. It gives us our access to the response object. Then we're going to put it in the route, in the router file. And we're going to, of course, pass that as an argument in routes. And then finally, in our index and in our show, we're going to pass it in. So now we have access to it. Actually, in addition to going to the console log, we are going to use the response object to write to the browser or whatever device is accessing or requesting our server. So I'm going to actually cut our response code from our server and first bring it to the index. So we are using the write head method, sending a 200 and telling what content type we're going to use. And then we're going to write our data in a second, and in the end we're going to end so let's just copy this same code in here, and I'm going to add an end of line or a return. For our show action, I'm going to do something a little bit differently. Go ahead and copy in this write head method. I'm going to grab these variables again, simulating some kind of pseudo database of users. And since this is a show action, we're going to show one particular user, say user 1, and then we'll end. Okay, let's see if that works. So let's start our index file, and actually let's run index. Yep, it goes through and gives us all our users and show. There we go, and foo should come back that no request file was found. Okay, it all works. Hooray! One last thing I want to show you. I want to simulate a long running process. Let's say it takes a long time. We're doing a long database call to get this this user 1. I'm going to create this var using set timeout, and I'm going to pass it an anonymous function, and that's where we're going to use our response object. All right. And we're going to give it, I don't know, let's say 10,000 milliseconds, 10 seconds. So I'm going to save that, start our server. And come over here and do our show. That's going to take a little bit of time, but our index comes back right away. And in about 10 seconds, we should see John Doe. And we do. Awesome. Okay, thanks for sticking with me. I hope this has given you kind of a better understanding of writing a simple router and controller. And that's all leading us back to Sails. And that's where I'm going to go next and show you some of the things that I've learned with Sails.js. So see you then.